There are stones older than memory, set here by hands that dreamed of the sun. Listen well, for the earth remembers.
Will you tell another?
For 3 nights, lad, and only if you listen.
Newgrange is a pretty neat construction. 5,000 years old. 5,000 years old. That predates Stonehenge. That predates the pyramids. 300 people, 20 years in the making, 5,000 years ago. Woohoo! So tonight I'll be sharing with you an excerpt from a book called Ireland, a novel by Frank Delaney. Let me read the back cover for you. In the winter of 1951, a storyteller, the last practitioner of an honored centuries-old tradition, arrives at the home of 9-year-old Ronan O'Mara in the Irish countryside. For 3 wonderful evenings, the old gentleman enthralls his assembled local audience with the narratives of foolish kings, fabled saints, and Ireland's enduring accomplishments before moving on. But these nights change young Ronan forever, sending him on a years-long pursuit of the elusive, itinerant storyteller, and the glorious tales that are no less than the saga of his own tenacious and extraordinary isle. Somehow it seemed like a story of us, sort of. Anyway, tonight will be the first of the 2-part story of the architect of Newgrange. We now join the tale as our storyteller stumbles out of a cold night and into the warm home and the heart of 9-year-old Ronan O'Mara. Wonderfully, it was the boy who saw him first. He glanced out of his bedroom window, then he looked again, and harder this time, and dared to hope. No, it was not a trick of the light. A tall figure in a ragged black coat and a ruined old hat was walking down the darkening hillside, and was heading toward the house. The stranger's face was chalk white with exhaustion, and he stumbled on the rough ground, his hands held out before him like a sleepwalker's. Oh, the man looked like a scarecrow deserting his post. High grasses soaked his cracked boots and drenched his coat hems. A mist, like a silver veil, floated above the ground, broke at his knees, and reassembled itself in his wake. In this twilight fog, mysterious shapes appeared and dematerialized, so the pale walker was never sure he'd seen merely the branches of trees or the arms of mythic dancers come to greet him. Closer in, the darker shadows of the tree trunks twisted into harsh and threatening faces. And across the fields he saw the yellow glow of lamplight in the window of a house. And the man raised his eyes to the sky in some kind of thanks. In the house ahead, the boy, 9 years old and blond as hay, raced downstairs, calling wildly to his father. Now this stranger's bones hurt, and his lungs ached almost beyond endurance. Hunger intensified his troubles. He'd eaten 1 meal in 3 days. The calm light in the window ahead pulled him forward in hope. If he held their attention, he might get bed and board for a week, and maybe more. In the days of the High King at Tara, a storyteller stayed 7 days and 7 nights. Did they know that? Oh, nobody knew anything anymore. With luck, though, the child in this house would help. Children want stories, and the parents might stretch their hospitality, fired by the delight in the boy's eyes. This house, the man prayed, would prove good. It was, after all, the great time of the year for telling of the stories, the time of All Souls, when the dead had permission to rise from their graves and prowl the land. At the house, past a small white gate, the tall man in the black coat stood and rapped twice on a brass knocker. Immediately the husband of the house opened the door. Ho, 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 ho. The stranger and the householder exchanged a solid handshake, eye to eye. Behind his father, the boy waited in the hallway, jigging from foot to foot. God save all here, said the stranger, much like Caledonia does. He hunched in his shoulders nervously. Over the years, his voice had grown deep and rotund. His manner and speech had an unusual formality, with trace elements of stately English from an earlier century and just a hint of classical learning. Consequently, his language rang generally more colorful than the speech of the people he met every day. The man of the house smiled and stood aside. Oh, come in, come in. Oh, you brought clear skies to us, you have. With your permission, I'll bring clear thoughts to you, too. Now, the woman of the house. She looked at this stringy, unwashed storyteller with skin like canvas. She knew he would disrupt her rigorous household. Nonetheless, she set a place for him while her husband, pleased and comfortable, poured the visitor a drink. The boy, Ah, the boy watched the stranger attacking the food like a tired hound. He sensed that the man's hunger fought with the man's decorum. Nobody spoke because the newcomer seemed too famished to be interrupted. The boy examined the man's face. He saw the long, thin scar. He wondered if he had been in a knife fight, maybe, perhaps with a sailor on some foreign quayside. And the sodden boots. In his mind, he saw the stranger fording streams, climbing out of gullies, traversing slopes of limestone shale, and his endless travels across the country. Did he have a dog? Seemingly not, which was a pity, since a dog could have sat guard by the fire at night. Did the man ever sleep in caves? The boy wondered. They said that bears and wolves had long been extinct in Ireland. Oh, but had they really? That evening, in the white house among the fields, a boy's most passionate dream came true. His father had long talked of the traveling storytellers. He said they possessed brilliant powers. The Shaughnekeys they were. They brought the long-gone past to life vividly, without what he called the interference of scholars. "Ah, those professors," he said, "they dry out history. They dry it out in order to put it down on paper." In the boy's father's view, a tale with the feeling taken out of it had no blood and was worth very little. But the old stories, told by the traveling Shawnee, the storytellers, round the fireside, on winter evenings, they came hurtling down, straight down the long, shiny pipeline of the centuries. And the characters, all love and hate and fire, tumbled out on our own stone floor. Well, so said his father. "And they're still among us, boy. I wouldn't be surprised if one of them came here one day. He'll probably be tall and old with boots and a hat. And you mark my words, son, he'll enchant us all, he will." Now, such a storyteller had finally arrived. He was the last of his breed. Figures like him had trudged the countryside for 25 centuries, telling the story of Ireland in one form or another. In the old days, they were beloved. A visit from one often gave a village its brightest moment of the year. Oh, they had counterparts all over the globe, to be sure. India, South America, China. Such travelers wandered into a village, spread a rug under a shady tree, and began a day-long tale of the country's old times. They called up dragons and fire and mountains and maidens and virgins and gods. Wary villagers who drifted forward to hear what was being said always stayed to the end. Whatever the topic, the audience knew they could be assured of vitality and drama. Great events told in bright colors with huge spirit. Thus the traveling storyteller. And his oral tradition shaped much of the world's culture and character. The storyteller finished his meal. He moved to a chair by the fire where he prepared to smoke a pipe. From a yellow oil cloth pouch, he offered a fill of tarry black tobacco to the husband, who thanked him and said that he didn't smoke. The stranger filled his pipe, picked up the iron tongs. He plucked a tiny ember from the fire. He planked it on top of the pipe. After much sucking and tapping, the tobacco glowed. The blue smoke drifted forward in search of the chimney. Aye. And then he leaned back in his chair. The boy had settled directly opposite him, on the cushions of a long wooden bench beside the hearth. The storyteller smiled at the boy, who still gazed, huge-eyed, at this sorcerous creature. "Do you know what an architect is?" The boy looked at his father for approval before he answered. A man who causes buildings." "Aye, and do you know where Newgrange is?" "Up in County Meath." "Sure enough. And may we ask you on the banks of what river?" The boy glanced again at his adored father. "I say, isn't it the Boyne? The Boyne?" At a noise from outside, the storyteller swung his head hopefully. The door heaved open. A man and a woman ambled in with two daughters, aged about 12 and 8. One was blonde and red-haired. They wore flowered pinafores. The younger girl was directed to join the boy on the high bench by the fire where she sat watching the storyteller with wonderland eyes. A coal fell forward on the hearth. The storyteller sucked vigorously on his pipe. Next moment, the audience increased again. Another couple strolled in from across the lane with their young daughter. Word had obviously spread. Perhaps someone among the farms had earlier seen the tall stranger's descent through the misty fields and guessed who or what he was. And so as the teleporters popped and pinged, the audience joined him. and he was pleased he would have an audience tonight. Whether he would have one tomorrow night, or even a venue to tell a story in, well, that would depend on him. After some minutes of talk and smiles, everyone settled down. No electricity in the houses those days. An oil lamp in the window and another with a glass sconce on the wall laid gilded shadows into the room. The firelight played on the storyteller's long face. He jiggled his pipe, eased back in his chair. He spread his shoulders and began. Every worthwhile story begins with the immortal words, "Once upon a time." Ha! Now never did a phrase ring so true as it will this evening. I've come to this hospitable and decent house to continue my life's work, to do what I do every night of the year, and that is to tell the story of Ireland. The tale I shall render you this evening concerns the most brilliant Irishman of all time. He was the architect of Newgrange. But as all stories should, this one begins before its own beginning. A story within a story, if it will. And that was a long, long time ago. Before there was ever a place called Newgrange. Before there was ever an architect to build its famous work. Even before there was a country called Ireland. And so, once upon a time, the ground upon which we walk was no more than a lump of stone down at the center of the earth. It was part of the thick shell containing that furnace that rages down there night and day, and that thick shell was always kept cool by the oceans that covered it. But in the early days of our planet, the shell was weak in places. The flames burst through again and again, and the vast layers of rock were flung up into the seas. This boiling volcanic surface spread over the prehistoric oceans. It split. It reformed into wide lands of nothing but black rock. And these split and reformed and cooled and split again until 2,500 million years ago, there were 5 continents. And these continents became all the countries of the world. And so every land on this planet is the child of ocean and rock, water and stone. Now every day, at every age since then, some rock or island somewhere crumbles and breaks off at the edge of some landmass. Many of those fragments still retain the shapes of the countries and the continents to which they were once joined. On the maps of my school days, some of them look like couples who have gone to sleep close to each other and then floated gently apart in the night. Tomorrow, you take out your atlas and look at Ireland and Britain. Together they look like a child curled up asleep near a larger child who's then curled up in the lee of the parent continent, Europe, huh? As that's how our own country and our most important neighbor began life, as stone born of fire and cooled by sea. Now, some of that ancient rock is with us still. And I can take you to a place far down on the east coast where you can see and touch it. Near Wexford, there's a stone, which the locals will tell you dates to 2 million years BC, before our good Lord. 200 miles higher up the coastline, as the crows flies. There's another rock in Antrim. Now I've looked closely at these 2 items. I can see the specks of quartz sparkling inside them. They look like eyes of little creatures who saw the mighty flames that imprisoned them in that rock long, long ago. So, the fact is, when the volcanic earth had mostly stopped heaving, Ireland amounted to nothing more than a cold field of stone. Now, much, much later, sediment from the universe floated over and settled on this stone acreage and spread and thickened there like a primal silt. Gradually, across those hard plains, there rose an island of rich loam and gentle hills, where today quiet rivers flow through green woods down to seas full of glimmering fish, or shiny horses and their foals gallop across the meadows in bountiful misty lands flowing with milk and honey. Yeah, that's how the world thinks of us today, isn't it? And we're glad of the compliment, which is accurate enough, isn't it? But it is not the whole story. Before the land finally settled, before the final phase of seeds blew in on the wind and fertilized it, and before the birds and the insects again made their homes here, we were also born of another great earthly power, the direct opposite of fire. We were born of ice. 4 ice ages attacked Ireland, one after another, and the ice took possession of everything. It destroyed any fertility that had been established, ruined any progress that nature had made. Wherever it met rock, the ice's freezing edges gleamed like the starched frills of folded cloth. It found hidden flaws in the mountains. It ripped them open. It filled them. Aye, they're what we call the glaciers. And in time, they became today's rivers and the largest rock faults. The ice cut channels wide enough to turn into eventual seas, and well, that's how Ireland was cut away from Britain. All the hills and highlands and all the ravines and hollows and gullies and gulches and every wrinkle and creek and every punch bowl of Ireland we know today was carved by the cruel hand of ice. They say the great ice takes hold slowly. It begins when the sun grows colder and the land bends under an endless chilling gale. The temperature sinks without mercy, and over the bald clay of the plains and valleys, a deep rime forms, squeezing out all plant and animal life. And across Ireland, one such pulverization followed another until the countryside became a carpet of impenetrable cold. That all happened in the accumulations of the first 3 ice ages. And then, just as things were thawing out once more, a last northern marauder settled Ireland's final shape. Aye, the savage 4th Ice Age. And 12,000 years ago, a vast sheet of compacted and frozen snow broke away from the Arctic Circle which surrounds the North Pole. It was thousands of feet thick, hundreds of miles broad, and when it finally rode down the curve of the planet, it looked like a floating country. They say that the ice on the move sounds like the beginning of the world, with shouts louder than the voice of God. Its shelves heave and crack. The intensity of its light alters every color it meets. Ice, they tell me, is never pure white, never a fixed or lone shade. It's ivory, it's silver, it is chalk, it is salt. Except that, according to the polar explorers, and I've met more than one of them in my own travels, ice is not white. Close up, it handles as white. At certain distances, it stands out as white. But those who know it well, who have stood upon it, lain on it, even fallen through it, they say that ice in bulk glows blue. Does it take its cue from the sky as the sea does, or is it a trick of the light? Maybe it has struck a pose to show how chilly it is, how menacing. Perhaps the blue is clothing, cladding, a gift of nature, as we know. She has all the best tricks, like all the wonderful women in our life do. Now, whatever the cause, the ice that broke away and sailed down those high Atlantic latitudes 12,000 years ago was as blue as a lady's gown. But it had other colors too. Only the best of tricks, Talia, only the best. Now, do you know the names of the noble metals? Gold, silver, platinum. All ice shines like those noble metals, and all color, as we know, is determined by where the light falls. As this island of ice moved south, I wonder how many shades of gold the sun sparked from it. Yellow and bronze and copper, amber, brass, and saffron. And then, at night under the wind-whipped moon, thousands of new shades glinted, mostly silver, soft or piercing or ominous or benign. And so there it was, sinister in its bright lights and content in its own power. Its noble metals flashed. The sound of its great crackings and creakings echoed across the waters, and the whole glimmering mass headed relentlessly down the northern seas like some great glowing ocean liner built for a nation of giants. This was the biggest iceberg ever seen, 1,000 times bigger than the one that sank the Titanic. It was its own landscape, its own geography. The fierce weather of the north had polished it like glass, and the harsh winds of the east had ruffled it and etched little furrows on the plated surfaces. These shales looked like rooked fabric or ebbing sands, and the whole mass had hogsbacks and crests and headlands and forelands, all sharp-edged, jagged, and crystal. The bow of this great vessel formed itself into a fierce and concentrated spearhead. It slammed forward in slabs and reefs so wide that the very horizon seemed made of ice. And it attacked Ireland with spikes 1/2 mile high and 1/2 mile wide. The first white prow crashed into the cliffs of our northernmost counties, Antrim, Derry, Donegal. Huge chunks of foreland fell away into the ocean and formed today's bays and harbors. High wedges of ice scythed out deeper inlets. You can gaze up at those cliffs today, and some of them look as if a great hand descended with a sharp knife and cut a sheer slice from the rock. After it came ashore, this great iceberg plunged south across the country. It kicked rocks and even hills out of its path. It scooped out valleys and glens that had never existed before. A few peaks and ridges were higher than the ice cliff, and they continued to raise their spears above the ice. You know them. Mountains like Errigal and Donegal, Galtymore and Tipperary, Patrick and Mayo, where the pilgrims after the Ice Age climbed to be nearer their gods. And do so to this very day, huh? But along the lower slopes and in the deep valleys and ravines, the ice fought every fold and won every groove. A new cold gripped the mountains so tightly that its chill penetrated to the stone's deepest core. Now, the wisest men tell us that everything, sooner or later, changes. And all change comes with a specific a moment, if you will. What we say to ourselves, well, I won't do this again. I must become different. And we succeed. Eventually. And so, one day, even the mighty ice changed. On that day, it started to shrink and retreat. One single day, 10,500 years ago, Ireland's climate began to alter. The chilling gale that came with the ice blew itself out. Softer breezes floated in from the west. Gentle and warm sea currents came from the southwest. A hot African wind rode up past the coast of Spain and caressed our southern shores. Gradually, these warm forces loosened the ice's awful grip. Its edge frayed by an inch at a time, and then by a yard, and then by a mile, and soon, like the pink-brown skin in the healing of a wound, the native earth of Ireland began to appear again. Now, I've described to you how the ice had ripped into the terrain on its advance. Well, it did so, too, on its retreat, much like kayakers' bulldozer can do, on a huge scale. Large melting slabs of ice gouged out caves and fjords and chasms. The ancient stone foundations of our land shook, undermined by the desperate, slipping ice. Rocky glens opened again as their walls crumbled. The clay began to breathe. Hills and mountains shone in the new sun, and down their slopes poured ribbons of new silver water. When you gaze at a mountain from a distance, you see a shining river that looks like the spoor of a snail. You can be sure that it was an Ice Age stream. The final loosening sent boulders sliding down the mountainsides and hurled stones down into valleys as the ice ripped them away from their rock bodies. These glacial erratics, as they're called, they loiter to this day all across the Irish landscape, some of them as big as houses. I myself, I've been glad of their shelter many times. And they lie at the core. They lie at the core of this story of Newgrange. As though to collect his breath, the storyteller halted. Puffs of steam rose from his wet boots as they dried in the heat of the fire. In the pause, people stirred. The boy looked anxiously at his mother to check her mood, and she seemed calm. His father took off his spectacles and polished them with a little amber cloth. Without his glasses, his sky-blue eyes sparkled. The boy pushed down his stockings and rubbed his shins, now hot and mottled from the fire. Nobody moved from where they sat. One or two of the men had taken off their jackets and sat shirt-sleeved. Their faces glowed with pride as much as heat. This epic account gave them the story of their own ancestry, the origins, the magnificence of their own country. The women seemed more placid, less intense in their enjoyment, but nonetheless enthralled. Nobody reflected the magic of the hour as much as the children, though, whose faces glowed like lamps. As the storyteller gathered strength for the next installment, he curled one hand around the bowl of his pipe. He raised the forefinger of the other hand commandingly. He drew 3, 4, 5 silent puffs on the pipe and took it from his mouth. This place, Newgrange, how much do you know about it? You might have read in the newspapers this great and mysterious edifice under the ground in County Meath. It's not far in from the coast. It's northwest of Dublin by about 30 miles or so. I know there's some here tonight who have probably done their thesis work on it, and some who've maybe only encountered it passingly. I've been there myself, and it's a mighty place in rich land on a hill above the River Boyne. The local people know all about it because over the centuries, many gentlemen and scholars have examined it, guessing at its history and building a good body of lore. A kind woman who lives on the hillside took me into what she called our cave. She lit a stub of a candle, and the flame was enough to display great wonders to me. This marvelous, immortal structure was built 5,000 years ago, before Stonehenge in England, even before the pyramids of Egypt. Every person in the world should visit it because it tells how amazing were the ancestors of man. It's a very inspiring place, and while I was there, I came to consider a great deal about it and the person who built it. And this story entered my mind. Now, the architect of Newgrange was a young man, possessed of a tall and thin physique, above which his wild head of tawny hair looked like a tree on fire. His deep-set eyes frightened the children. His manner took no account of courtesy, which is to say that he treated people abruptly. Until the events occurred that I'm about to relate to you, he had spent much of his life in silence, speaking only when spoken to, never offering friendship, generally avoiding the burden of conviviality. This was the life of the aloof. If we wish to excuse someone for being like that, we say, they're shy. And I do believe this man was a shy child and grew up as a shy young man. At one stage of his life, this remote and strange individual began to invest a deep interest in the observation of stone. Now, by stone, I mean those rocks I've just described to you that were cast down the mountains when the ice melted. Now, to most people, a stone is a stone, nothing more and nothing less than a rock. But this young man grew to love stone the way farmers love cattle, the way women love children, the way boys love pretty girls, the way the waves love the shore. To him, stone seemed to speak. Oh, he didn't hear a voice, but he understood it just the same, because deep in his mind a picture formed of the world as it must have been long, long ago, before there were trees with leaves or animals with fur. Stone brought the past to him and brought him to the past. And now this man's people, who commanded the hill of Newgrange, they lived handsomely. Their land of rich brown clay was left behind 10,000 years ago, a great wide silt over after the ice melted. Like all such terrain in Europe, was discovered by travelers coming over from the east in search of a fertile living. In Ireland, they found a good and a pleasant home. Hazel and rowan trees already covered the plains and grew down the mountain sides and into the valleys. Wide, slow rivers took the voyagers in from the coast on the logs of their simple rafts. And they discovered that if they cleared the trees, they could settle almost anywhere, because the earth was so easy to cultivate. Hillsides proved the best places. They could live off the fine land and cast an eye over the surrounding countryside for approaching dangers. Newgrange proved ideal. Newgrange, a high hill with good soil overlooking a placid river. People settled there very early, 6,000 years before the birth of our Christ, and they began to work the earth of the Boyne Valley. In those far-off days, everyone on such a hillside labored hard. From the age a child could lift or scrabble to the oldest man or woman able to drag or push, they hauled, imparted, and combed the clay. The soil they tilled was warm and deep and full of different colors, honey or red gold or mahogany. Scatter seeds there and something always grew. And every year they turned the soil. They sowed their seeds, they welcomed the rain, they hailed the sun, and they were happy. Yet for all their prosperity and for all their good fortune, they made slow progress in life, because they hadn't yet discovered anything better to work with than stone. They depended upon it for their weapons and tools. They handled it well. In their hands, stone made stone. Using stone tools, they hammered out new stone implements, knives and chisels, copied from shards of stone they found among the occasional little beaches of shale on the banks of the river. They also established what you might call local factories. These were places to which they hauled the rocks they found strewn in the countryside. Hacking into such boulders with stone axes and sledgehammers, they cut javelins and arrows and more hammers and better stone axes. Every stone in the world has a cutting point, a place on which the stone where the cleanest break may be achieved. The men who made those weapons knew how to find that fault line. how to split a stone as neatly as a slice. A more provocative might call it the cleavage plane. As every stonemason has understood since the gods were born, when you add edge to weight, your cutting power doubles. And once they had mastered how to use it, nothing resisted their stone. The skull of a foe, the neck of a beast, the crest of a slope, everything yielded to it. And that is how our young man, with the tawny, wild hair and the deep-set eyes, first came to such a closeness with stone. He found that he had a gift for using it expertly. He understood economy, how to get strong results from controlled circumstances. His weapons and tools seemed neater, more efficient, more powerful than anyone else's because he realized that no daggers need be too long. No axe need be too heavy. A weapon's power only springs to life in the hands of its user. And those he made for himself always had perfect balance. His gift was stone. Saved the young man's life once. One day, breaking the branches in the trees where the forest had been forced back from the hill of Newgrange, he heard a noise. He looked up and he saw a bear glaring at him from the ferns. She probably had cubs nearby because bears, by and large, tend to leave people alone unless they fear for their young. Now, the young man had no intention of troubling this creature. But Mama Bear didn't know that. The brown fur stood up at her neck. He could see the red pink of her gums, the white spikes of her teeth, and the rage and the terror in her eyes. On the ground near his feet, his bare toes felt a heavy rock shard as long as a short sword. He stood very still, watching the bear carefully, his feet teasing the shard of stone into position. With a great roar, she rushed toward him. He bent swiftly, snatched up the shard, and drove the stony spike high into the bear's throat. The force of his thrust almost broke his hand, but he had enough strength to twist the weapon. He saw blood on the stone. Not much, enough to tell him he had wounded the animal. The bear stepped back and collected herself to attack again, but the young man lunged forward, this time roaring wildly. The bear recoiled farther. The young man struck again and again, until the bear keeled over backward. He jumped on her, and he hammered the shard into her neck over and over until she was dead. Now, the people of Newgrange had their own government. Elders and eldresses who passed the laws and made the decisions that regulated life on the hillside. They addressed all spiritual matters, too, such as when, why, and how to make sacrifices to the gods. One year, as the leaves turned gold, the elders held a special meeting. The harvest had again been abundant, and as they blessed their fortune, they began to discuss, in the warmth of the moment, finding a way to thank their ancestors, to honor their dead. And the chief elder, his face very serious, said, "We must build something that will be remembered for. That we will be remembered for. We must build a structure that will not only respect our forefathers, but will also preserve the spirit of our people. A great meeting was called, to which almost everyone on the hillside came. But the arguments grew so heated that they had to convene again and again and again. To and fro the discussions raged. What would constitute an eternal honor, and how is it to be done? Now, I have said that almost everyone on the hillside attended those debates. One voice did not speak. Our wild young man stayed away from there. Nobody uttered surprise at his absence. Many expressed relief. They had always found him a little odd. He didn't say much to many, but in the previous few years they'd avoided him even further because they begun to fear him, and with good reason. One day our young man had suddenly and openly killed 2 men. His status as a warrior may have placed him above punishment, but his deed caused the hillside fear. Folk evaded him, didn't meet his eyes, chose not to work alongside him. No, what they did not know, and he never told, was the reasons he had killed the 2 men. I think perhaps Kieran may approve. The day after the bear's death, the young man had grown despondent with remorse. He couldn't endure the fact that when he had killed the bear, out of necessity, he had also orphaned her cubs. So he took off into the forest to bring them back and try to rear them. He never found them. 3, 4, 5 days he searched in the forest, checking lairs, taking risks, but no cubs could he find. When he returned to Newgrange, he came upon a commotion. A bunch of lesser men had found the cubs, had killed one, were burning the second cub on the spit. The young man raced up the hill, arrived at the squealing cub, 2 months old, shuddered and died, blood oozing from its eyes, its fur scorched black. Then he killed the man who was holding the cub. With an axe lying nearby, they split the fellow diagonally from shoulder to hip. And then he pounded a hole in the man's forehead. The first cub was already being skinned by one of the men, a nice fur cap for the winter, eh? He killed him, too. This time not bothering with attacking the body, he just split the man's head wide open. The bystanders, who a minute earlier had been laughing at the sport with the bear cubs, scattered like a chaff in the wind. But from that moment, everyone avoided the young man. Bit graphic, sorry, but it was 5,000 years ago. They all avoided the young man, and he made it easy for them. The incident filled him with dreadful feelings, and he took off into the forest again. Thereafter, his taste for lone roving grew larger. He also knew that his rage had been released, and he knew that when that happened, he had no way of reining it in. So whenever he felt angry, he vanished for days or weeks at a time. And while he roamed, he looked at everything he saw in the world and tried to imagine its origins. And that was how he came to love stone. Everywhere he went, he scrutinized some new boulder or slab, relishing the sight and the bulk and the feel of it. And who's to say he didn't now and then run his tongue over a rock and taste one of life's joys, a fresh little pool of rainwater in the hollow of a crag immediately after a shower. No, sadly, I doubt there was any cream there, but rainwater is tasty nonetheless. And then came the day of the last big meeting. No matter what the wild young man's reputation, regardless of how rough or dangerous or foolish he was generally thought to be, a number of the elders believed in him and began to raise his name as the man for the job. He might seem unsteady at times, they agreed, perhaps a touch mad. His rages might cause havoc. But the eldresses perceived in him the potential of a great doer as well as a dreamer, and the chief elder believed him the best weapon maker, the most intelligent of the farmers, and, well, something of a visionary. So he persuaded him to come to the final meeting. This was to be the day of decision. From early afternoon, the people began to assemble in the longhouse, the elders' parliament building. A great wide fire lit the darkness in the windowless chamber. Men, women, children squatted on skins scattered across the mud floor. The chief elder spoke first. He announced that although he wanted to hear further argument, he hoped they would now decide as to how and with what and where they would build this great, eternal monument. Well, so far, all they had agreed was that they should use wood. The wild young man had come in late and stood near the door. He kept his head down, looked at no one. The chief elder, who had personally invited him, asked for his views, called him forward. Reluctantly, he came up to where the elders stood. He coughed to clear his throat and spoke. He began by addressing the sacredness of the mighty project. They all claimed, he said, that they wished nothing less than the finest possible memorial. Our dead, he said, will always be with us. Therefore, we must honor them with something that would always be there. Now, we can't say that of wood. Wood does not last. Oh, yes, he agreed wood was beautiful. A child knew that. But wood rotted. A child knew that, too. Maggots ate into the wood, and the rain did the rest. There's only one thing that lasts. That is stone. He held out the fingers of one hand and counted. 1, stone was magnificent in appearance. 2, it came from the ancient world. 3, it would last to the end of time. 4, it could be shaped. 5, would accept carved messages of respect and belief. 6, the wolf can't blow it down, no matter how hard he blows. Then the man closed his mouth and sat down on the floor. People stared at the wild young man, their mouths gaping. They turned to each other, dumb with wonder. Their faces reflected unasked questions, and then from every corner in the safety of their numbers, voices began to attack him. What did he know? How could he be so foolish, so impractical? They could easily ferry wood, but how could anyone transport stone? Beneath each complaint, accusation lay an ignoble question. Who was he? A moody killer to tell them they were wrong? Their words danced like sparks across the shadows of the longhouse. The young man rose and spoke again, his high-pitched voice sounding something like a girl's, and he looked lean and disturbing. He did not say, "You fools," but his tone conveyed it. "Don't you understand? Stone is unyielding, but not unfriendly. The marks we make on it will last forever. What could be more suited to remind us and our children's children of who has gone before?" But he was speaking to people who had never thought deeply of stone. To them, stone was like air or water. No personality until you do something with it, and it lies out there in the fields doing nothing, with badges of moss all over it. What more was to be said of it except that it yielded a good axe now and then? The young man had a little concern for what Newgrange thought. Like many great people, all he cared about was what he felt and what he wanted to do. The force of his passion made everyone peer at him, and the light from the fire made him look more mysterious. His head of tawny hair seemed to flare wilder. The wrinkles on his brow grew darker, his deep-set eyes lost in the shadows of his face. Slamming one fist repeatedly into the palm of the other hand, he made point after point. "I sense more things than I can name. I understand more than I can describe. Visions come to me in flashes of light that I can't explain. But all of you, you all have such feelings. Look for them in your hearts." In a voice powerful enough to fight off all comers, he told them that one of life's greatest mysteries lay within stone. No matter how it was approached, whether attacked, caressed, or cut wide open, stone never surrendered the story of its origins. As with ourselves, we don't know where it came from. It must have belonged to the beginning of the world. His listeners shivered. They felt the same uncomfortable wonder as he did, because the young man had touched a dim, half-true knowledge. In his passion for stone, he had placed his hand on something inside every one of them. Now he tightened his grip. Sometimes at dawn, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes when a breeze feathers the waters of the river, we tremble inside and we wonder what power that we cannot see but we can feel guides us. What great spiritual authority governs our lives. That's the force of our ancestors. We mustn't commemorate them with anything that's less than immortal. In the awed silence that followed, the chief elder stepped in and said that he proposed to appoint the wild young man as architect. The young man did not react at all. One of the elders, though, sensed the discomfort among the people, and he felt that many might think they had been ridden over roughshod. This man had a suave ways and a silky voice, and he knew how to persuade folk to his point of view. We shall call him the silken elder. If he spoke to you, his voice never rose. When he stood conversing, he held his hands folded on his stomach, and a little pursed smile that always danced on his plump mouth. Now, in fairness, he himself had much distinction. This was the elder who took responsibility for all the rituals practiced on the hillside. The praising of the rain, the warning of the coming storms, the songs to the sun. If some unusual act of nature, such as lightning or a whirlwind, drove fear through the people, he was the one who uttered smooth words to fight the danger. He was the man who taught Newgrange how to make offerings to the skies, the trees, the river, and he worked all this so calmly and soothingly that many people liked him. Alas, though, this elder himself was a dangerous man. In short, he was a liar, an untrustworthy and shifty man, insincere. The silken elder decided that it would be to his advantage to speak for the people who disagreed with the decision they had just heard. Smoothly, he began to question the young man. "What are you going to build? How long will it take?" "I will create something the world has never seen, something it will always consider extraordinary." His astonishing reply quietened the room somewhat. Even the silken elder was taken aback, but he hurried not to show it. He attacked afresh. "And how do we know you won't abandon the job before it's finished?" Hmm? Now that insult sent a hiss of wonder through the crowd. The young man looked calmly nowhere and never said a word. So the silken elder tried again. "Do you intend to be answerable at all? These folks, this room, these are your people. Will you answer to them? To your elders? Will you answer to anyone? Our young man never moved, never spoke. The questions drew none of his blood. He knew enough to wait. Soon the silken elder fell silent, appealing to the audience with raised arms as if to say, I don't know what we can do about this fellow. And the young architect of Newgrange turned around and walked across to where the silken elder stood. As though it were a lamp, he thrust his big, tawny young head forward, 6 inches from the silken elder's face. He shone the beam of his eyes straight at the man. Like 2 boxers, they glared at each other for a long moment. The silken elder broke first. He stepped away. Well, I can understand why you mightn't wish to disclose your plans in detail. But it isn't enough to hear your love of stone. You refuse to tell us anything. Therefore, to protect ourselves in case you fail us on such an important enterprise, we should declare ourselves entitled to a recompense. Recompense. A blood oath. Recompense was the payment for failure to deliver on a vow, and it guaranteed a slow, humiliating death. In recompense, at least the recompense of 5,000 years ago. First, the offender was pegged out like a hide to the hillside. There he lay for 24 hours. At noon on the next day, a warrior came and cut off the offender's right arm at the shoulder. On the 3rd day at noon, the left arm. Slaves would staunch the blood with mud, leaves, and skins to prevent the offender bleeding mercifully to death. On the 4th day at noon, the warriors cut off the right leg. At the 5th noon, the left leg. On the 6th day at noon, they prized out the eyes. They sliced off the ears. They pulled out his tongue. And on the 7th day, they filleted the body like butchers. Recompense. Some weeks later, when the wind and rain washed all the flesh from the skeleton, the whitening bones would be collected with the lowest bondswoman on the hillside and cast out in the countryside for the wild animals to gnaw. That was recompense. A dreadful matter, to be sure. The word chilled the spine of every man, woman, and child in Newgrange. All chatter, all murmuring, all noise in the long room died. Every eye watched the clashing pair. The architect had seen the recompense more than once. He had even been called upon to participate in it. At last, he nodded slowly. Like a man thinking aloud, he turned to face the people. I understand, he said. But if you, all of you, eventually agree that I have accomplished a satisfactory and eternal commemoration, then, and he spun round to face the older man, then I will take your elder's robe, and you will pay the recompense. A soft roar came up from the people. This young man knew the laws of Newgrange. A person threatened with the recompense had the right to turn it on his challenger, even an elder. In the shocked hush, the silken elder had no choice. I agree, he said, soft-spoken, but very angry. He tried to recover his position a little, using all the powers of his silken voice. So, well, what can you tell us about how long... I will tell you nothing, interrupted the architect. He left the longhouse abruptly. The meeting broke up. There wasn't a man or a woman there who didn't feel astounded. From that moment, one September day 50 centuries ago, the architect began to plan the great white circular building of the hillside at Newgrange above the River Boyne. And from that moment he knew that the silken elder would plot every day to cause his downfall, to wreck his project. Because any time a great man tries to do a wonderful thing, lesser men will try to stop him. That is one of the laws of life. There lived on that hillside a certain lady. This lady was tall, she had thin brown hair, and she was known as the Angry Woman. Her husband was dead, killed by a mad elk, spiked on its horns one morning when he was blinded by the sun and unable to measure how close the animal had come. Some had said that the goring of her man had made this woman angry. Others that she had, well, she had always been angry, they said, except with her own child, a red-haired girl, 8 years old, whom she loved as a tigress loves her cub. Now, since the end of her mourning, this angry woman had desired a new husband. And the mate she wanted was our young man. If, wild or not, he seemed eligible before, well, now he had become a prize, in her eyes as well as many others. She had watched him for some time, studied his mixtures of tenderness and anger, saw the efficient way he dealt with things round and about the hillside, and observed, above all, his impatience. His impatience with fools. Now, shrewd women, and she was shrewd, always value intelligence in a man, rare as it may be. And here was a fellow who had the brains and the handsome looks. And now he had power. She didn't care that he was moody. Well, hell, she was moody herself. Once or twice she'd approached him, knowing she risked his snub. At a feast she filled his plate. He never even looked at her. And one day she rushed to help him when he was building a hut. The roof tree fell. She grabbed the pole, and for a moment they stood side by side, arms touching until they could haul the beam upright. Again, no acknowledgement came from him. When he left the meeting that day, the architect went alone down the hill. He had a walk like the lope of a wolf. Behind him the crowd lingered, chattering like sparrows on a roof. At the doorway of the long house, the angry woman stood for a moment, looked down, and saw the man of her desires striding toward the river. Her heart still raced at the excitement she had just witnessed. She wanted to talk to him in this moment of triumph, but she didn't wish him to know how she felt. Once again, she faced the difficulty of this man. When she met him or spoke to him, he improved the way she felt. He enlarged her life. He made the day bright and bearable. But he gave her no direct or tangible evidence that she had any effect of any kind upon him. After a moment's thought, she followed him. To disguise her intention, she took a different route. Where he had gone to the south, she headed west, to the reed beds, and began plucking rushes to cover the earthen floor of her home. She hoped that he would see her, and soon he did. When she lifted a sheaf of the green, wide blades from the water's edge, the swing of her white arms caught his eye. The architect gestured to the angry woman and began to walk toward her. She stopped building her rush pile and waited for him, anxious. She ran her tongue along the back of her upper teeth. Our young man held out his hand, and she took it. She could see he was agitated. She could see that he had difficulty controlling his mood. And so she stroked his bare forearm and led him into the grove along the river bank. Inside the trees, where nobody on the hill could now see them, they lay down on the grass. She began to talk to him. She said that he had been given a great honor, that nobody could carry it off better than he could, that should he need any help, he had but to ask her. And slowly but surely she calmed him down. And through it all he never said a word. In a clear western sky the sun shone. Some time passed, and the breeze ruffled the water. The couple lay on the ground, hugging each other tighter and tighter. Eventually the architect stood up and walked silently away. From the edge of the grove he turned to look at the angry woman who sat up. He walked back to her. He bent down. He stroked her hair kindly. Then he helped her to her feet, and they went their separate ways. Along the river bank, little areas of mud rested, where the water sometimes flooded in and ebbed away. Over one of these the architect crouched and began to think. Behind him on the water, two men worked on a raft, repairing it. One fixed a loose log while the other held the raft steady. From the folds of his deerskin tunic, the architect took a small pointed stone. With this he began to etch patterns in the soft black mud. Nothing he drew satisfied him, and he leaned back on his haunches. But when he looked up, his eye caught the cross-sectioned face of the log on the raft, and he saw the rings that tell the tree's age, a circle for every year. A tree grows a new ring in 12 months. He looked at this pattern for several moments, and then he etched again in the ground. This time he drew a series of whirling circles, not unlike the face of the log. Getting restless, he rose, walked further along the river bank, began to sketch on a different patch of mud. This time he drew a picture of the hill of Newgrange. Now, like any painter, he looked up now and then to check his proportions, even though it was composed of very few lines. This picture took him several minutes. When he had finished it, he stood to his full height in order to look down on the drawing at his feet. Then his mind's eye filled with this new perspective. He stared at the hill again, assessing the shape and the depth. At that moment, the angry woman came back to the edge of the wood, and her arms full of rushes stood where he could see her. She smiled cautiously at him and walked forward to where he could see her better. In doing so, she stepped into a pool of sunlight, and her smile turned to gold. Now, there's an old saying, a man's love is of a man's life a thing apart. 'Tis a woman's whole existence. Now, the way the angry woman smiled at the architect was important to her, but not to him. Oh, he saw her all right. He even gazed at her, but he didn't smile back. Instead, he turned away. He crouched again, and in the mud, he drew a beautiful sketch. He drew a wide circle, then a thick single line entering the circle, and at the far end of the line inside the circle, he drew a rough cross. By now, his entire body quaked with excitement, especially when in 4 last strokes he made a clear drawings of a small rectangular box. The architect stood up exhausted. He knew he had just had a wonderful inspiration. He knew he had decided that this great monument of Newgrange would be, and what it would look like. The thrill of it, the brilliance it contained. It was such a simple idea, but he also recognized it would be very difficult to achieve. Quite simply, the architect of Newgrange had decided to make the sun in the sky to do his bidding. Genius, works in many ways. In some people, it comes at the end of years spent thinking deep and endless thoughts. With others, the brilliant idea flashes into the mind from nowhere. The way a hawk attacks with the sun behind it. That afternoon, the architect felt his mind climbing higher and higher. He was brave to the utmost, brave as brave can be, thinking thoughts of great daring and then swooping to draw exactly what he wanted to express. Can I, he had asked himself as he drew his pictures in the mud, can I capture the sun, the very sun, to keep our dead warm? Seeking an answer to the question, he had looked back over his shoulder at the flowing waters of the River Boyne and had seen the sunlight on the angry woman's smiling face, and his imagination announced to his brain, light also flows. Now, if there was any true justice in the world, that shining moment, the arrival of that idea, would have inspired the architect to go over to where the angry woman stood, take her in his arms, thank her profoundly for what was arguably the most brilliant idea that he, or any Irishman, before or since, would ever have. But he did not do that. He turned away. That very night, the architect chose his first team of workers, 5 people, 4 men of Newgrange, and the angry woman herself. No plan did he divulge to them, no schedule of works, no path of progress. Instead, he said, "You must tell nobody, ever, anything of what we do. Do you understand me?" They understood all right. They understood that he might kill anyone who betrayed his confidences. We're really close, Pika, really, really, really close. To keep the matters entirely secret, he never showed them or anyone those final pictures he had drawn in the mud. He memorized them so thoroughly that whenever he wished, he could draw the images again in a few seconds. The circle, the long-legged cross, the simple rectangular box. Like all great drawings, they had no unnecessary lines. Next morning, he led his workers westward out into the deep countryside, carrying nothing but food wrapped in leaves. The 5-strong team walked silently behind them for 2 hours. At last, he stopped by a grove and pointed down a steep slope to a large flat stone half hidden in the ferns. This stone measured 4 times the width of his own body and twice his height. "Bring this back to the hillside." The 4 men of the team looked at him, looked at each other. Impossible. First, they must ease it from the earth, or more likely dig it out, and a stone like that could go down 10 yards deep. It might even be a mountain top. Then they must transport it over hills and through gullies, up and down, across mixed terrains, back to the hillside. Did it have to travel whole? No stone you bring back may be broken. So, tell me, how will you accomplish this? And the 4 men looked at each other and thought, no, this isn't possible. All day, these 4 men had been perpetrating a nasty injustice because they hadn't spoken a word to the angry woman. Now, it's true that they feared her a little, but more than that, they didn't respect her cleverness, and it irked them that she had been included as an equal member on their team. In their disrespect, they made their position more foolish, because when the men failed to offer a solution, the architect raised an eyebrow to the angry woman. "What would you do?" She looked all around them. "Half a page to go, Pika." She looked all around, at the ferns, at the trees, at the steep hill down which they had scrambled to reach this rock. Her hair had been washed in the river that morning and shone like light. A thin red line marked her face where a branch had slapped her across cheek and brow. "I know what to do." The 4 men looked at her suspiciously, but the architect nodded. One man opened his mouth to say, "Explain," but she quelled him with a look that might kill a bull. From that moment, the angry woman became the team's leader. The architect left his team prizing loose their stone and went back to Newgrange. He asked the women to assemble the children of the hillside. He said he needed helpers. He chose teams of boy and girl pairs. Next day, he led the first pair, a 10-year-old boy and the angry woman's young daughter, out into the countryside. Both children carried small bunches of pointed twigs. When he found a stone he wanted to build with, the architect directed one of the children to plant a pointed stick beside it. Some days later, he went back to find the angry woman and her co-workers. They had lifted the stone and had left the grove. All he saw was a wide, shallow crater of brown earth. He followed the trail that had gouged in the earth with a big rock, and at last, from a hilltop, he saw them down at the river. The angry woman had thought to cut down the tree and use the trunks as rollers and across the countryside, and now at the river bank, she had ordered the men to build a little pier of smaller rocks and tree branches. They had rolled the stone onto this jetty and then lashed the logs together and made a raft. She made them double the structure, building one raft on top of another with some overlaps to guarantee buoyancy. "It'll float better that way," she said. Her calculations worked. As the architect watched, they eased the stone onto the raft. No catastrophe occurred. After a slight dip and some shaky moments, the raft with the rock sat afloat, the river buoyant. All four men stood in the river ready to guide it, and the woman climbed onto the stone on the raft. They moved as fast as the river's currents. The architect kept pace with them along the ridge above the river bank. What a pleasing sight! A great, flat, sand-colored rock, sitting like a captured animal astride a raft of tree trunks tied with soft, springy branches. And the angry woman lying face down on the stone, using her hands as oars. And so, after many hours, they came safely to Newgrange, where, with much commotion, they rolled the great stone up the hill. The architect and his workers put it in place. That stone now stands at the entrance to his mysterious structure. And that ends part one of our story of the architect of Newgrange. This story is an excerpt from a book called Ireland, a Novel by Frank Delaney. It's a big, thick book, about this thick. Okay, you can't quite see that, but picture me holding my fingers a long ways apart. It's a big book. In fact, let me read the back cover for you. In the winter of 1951, a storyteller, the last practitioner of an honored centuries-old tradition, arrives at the home of 9-year-old Ronan O'Mara in the Irish countryside. For 3 wonderful evenings, the old gentleman enthralls his assembled local audience with narratives of foolish kings, fabled saints, and Ireland's enduring accomplishments before moving on. But these nights change young Ronan forever, setting him on a years-long pursuit of the elusive, itinerant storyteller, and the glorious tales that are no less than the saga of his own tenacious and extraordinary isle. Now, last week we began our tale with our storyteller as he stumbled out of the cold night and into the warm home and the heart of 9-year-old Ronan O'Mara. And our storyteller began the story of the architect of Newgrange with an epic account of the ancestry, the origins, and the magnificence of Ireland, reaching back millions of years to the dawn of time and coming forward to a day in the Neolithic or the Stone Age that happened 5,000 years ago in Ireland. And that is when the marvelous, immortal structure known as Newgrange was built. Before Stonehenge in England, before the pyramids of Egypt, was Newgrange. When we closed our tale last week, the architect of Newgrange had just gained the appointment from his tribe to build a monument that would stand forever to honor their ancestors. We join our story now on the evening of that appointment as the architect undertakes this daunting task. Now, that very night, the architect chose his first team of workers, 5 people, 4 men of Newgrange, and the angry woman who had thanklessly provided him assistance and confidence. Now, no plan did the architect divulge to them, no schedule of works, no path of progress. Instead, he said, "You must tell nobody anything. Ever, never, ever tell anybody anything of what we do. Do you understand?" They understood all right. They understood that he might kill anyone who betrayed his confidences. ever, never ever, not even then can you tell anybody. Got it? To keep the matter entirely secret, he never showed them, or anyone, those final pictures he had drawn in the mud. The architect remembered them so thoroughly that whenever he wished, he could draw the images again in a few seconds. The circle, the long-legged cross, the simple rectangular box. Like all great drawings, they had no unnecessary lines. And so the next morning he led his workers westward, out into the deep countryside, carrying nothing but food wrapped in leaves. The 5-strong team walked silently behind him for 2 hours. At last he stopped by a grove and pointed down a steep slope to a large flat stone half hidden in the ferns. It measured 4 times the width of his body and twice his height. Bring this back to the hillside. The 4 men of the team looked at each other. Impossible. First, they must ease it from the earth, or more likely dig it out, and a stone like that could go down 10 yards deep. It might even be a mountaintop. And then, if they got it out, they must transport it over hills, through gullies, up, down, across mixed terrain, back to the hillside. Well, did it have to travel whole, they asked him. No stone you bring back may be broken. So tell me, how will you accomplish this? The 4 men looked at each other and thought, no, this isn't even possible. So all day these 4 men had been perpetrating a nasty injustice, you see, because they had not spoken a single word to the angry woman. Now it's true that they feared her a little, but more than that, they didn't respect her cleverness. And it irked them that she had been included as an equal member of their team. In their disrespect, they made their position even more foolish, because when the men failed to offer a solution, the architect raised an eyebrow to the woman. What would you do? He asked her. The angry woman looked all around, at the ferns, at the trees, at the steep hill down which they had scrambled to reach this rock. Her hair had been washed in the river that morning and shone like a light. A thin red line marked her face where a branch had slapped across her cheek and eyebrow. I know what to do. The 4 men looked at her suspiciously, but the architect nodded, as if he knew it all along. She would know. One man opened his mouth to say, Explain, but she quelled him with a look that might kill a bull. Oh yeah, I'm familiar with that look. From that moment, the angry woman became the team's leader. The architect left his team prizing loose their stone and went back to Newgrange. He asked the women to assemble the children of the hillside. He said he needed helpers, and he chose teams of boy and girl pairs. Next day, he led the first pair, a 10-year-old boy and the angry woman's own young daughter, out into the countryside. Apparently I do it too, Rick. At least I'm good at obtaining it. Both children carried small bunches of pointed twigs. When he found the stone he wanted to build with, the architect directed one of the children to plant a pointed stick beside it. Some days later, he went back to find the angry woman and her co-workers. They had lifted the stone, and they had left the grove. All he saw was a wide, shallow crater of brown earth. He followed the trail they had gouged in the earth of their big rock, and at last from a hilltop he saw them down at the river. The angry woman had thought to cut down trees and use the trunks as rollers across the countryside. And now, at the river bank, she had ordered the men to build a little pier of smaller rocks and tree branches. They had rolled the stone onto this jetty, and then lashed together the logs and made a raft. She'd made them double the structure, building one raft on top of another with some overlaps to guarantee the buoyancy. It will float better, she said. And her calculations worked. As the architect watched, they eased the stone onto the raft, and no catastrophe occurred. After a slight dip and some shaky moments, the raft with the rock sat afloat, the river buoying. And after a slight dip and some shaky moments, the raft with the rock sat afloat, the river buoying. I already said that, didn't we? All 4 men stood in the water ready to guide it, and the woman climbed onto the stone on the raft. And why not? They moved as fast as the river's current. The architect kept pace with them along a ridge above the river bank. Ah, what a pleasing sight! A great, flat, sand-colored rock, sitting like a captured animal astride a raft of tree trunks tied with soft, springy branches, and the angry woman lying face down on the stone, using her hands as oars. And so after many hours they came safely to Newgrange, where, with much commotion, they rolled the great stone up the hill. The architect and his workers put it in place, and that very stone now stands at the entrance to his mysterious structure. That's one. Now, for the next 12 years, the people of Newgrange made hundreds of these journeys for stone. No idle day passed. Every morning, hail, rain, or snow, parties of workers left the hillside, traveled to some distant rock marked by the architect and his child helpers, and hauled it back to the hill. In the process, they developed the first roads in County Meath. A team hauling a stone through the countryside would come across a great brown scar on the earth, and they'd know that it was open. They'd know it was the mark left by the previous team hauling a rock. If they followed this trail, it would lead often, but not always, to the water. By the end of the first year, 300 people were employed hauling stones from the distances of up to 30 miles away. Most of these workers came from the ranks of the least skilled. The architect thought of them the way a queen bee thinks of her drones. He gave them miserable lives, using them as he wanted, with no consideration. Indeed, he scarcely seemed to regard them as human. In his eyes, they all had only one purpose. His purpose. No allowances were made for age or sex. A girl of 14 worked as rough and raw as an old man of 44. And 44 was old in those days. They suffered frightful injuries. In the cold weather, their hands froze to the surface of the stone. They slipped on the rocks. The bindings made of thin branches ripped their flesh. Flash floods on the water left them gasping and terrified, or dead on the riverbed. Hauling stones across the steep landscape, their bones snapped, their backs broke. Many of them, men, women, and children, became cripples for life. And then the hazards increased. As the architect developed the site, he chose larger and larger stones. Some rocks fell on the laborers, hitting or shattering an arm or leg, or a boulder keeled over, bringing instant death through a crushed skull or rib cage. When that happened, he ordered the corpse hauled to one side and left there for the family to collect. Nothing, the architect said, must interfere with the work. Yeah, so pretty much like working today. A hard man when young, he grew harder with age. He reserved his tenderness for his materials. When a new rock arrived, he paid it as much attention as a cat to her kitten, or a mama kanga to her baby roo, stroking, measuring, examining each side, each surface, each little ripple. When he supervised the final placing of a stone, people nearby observed that he spoke more quietly than his normal high-pitched rasp. And while he hardened at work, he seemed in himself become a somewhat happy man, certainly a fulfilled man. He'd embarked upon a great enterprise, and he felt himself succeeding at it. Away from the sight, he seemed more approachable, and some people surmised that he might have softened, perhaps changed. He looked easier, less tense and hostile. The angry woman's admiration grew for the architect, grew and grew. She thought him wonderful. He possessed qualities she wanted in a man. He was strong, he was decisive, he was inspired. And so she stayed near him, and without ever asking him, she appointed herself his closest helper. When he forgot to eat, she brought him food. When he looked exhausted, she suggested rest. If some good news reached the hillside, she brought it to him first, and she tried not to allow herself to feel slighted when he retired to his house at the end of every day without inviting her, sometimes without seeming to see that she existed. She told herself, I shall ignore the hurt. I shall be patient. I shall content myself to wait. And then one day, when all this has been completed, he'll take me into his life. He made one gesture that encouraged her to bide her time. 6 years into the enterprise, the angry woman's daughter reached the age of 14, old enough to work as a messenger. The architect appointed her into his service. The girl was delighted, but not nearly as pleased as her mother. After all, no one knew him as well or saw more of him. She knew his moods, his tempests. What she did not know was the fear under which he worked. Everywhere he went, he could see the sleek face of the silken elder, watching him, eyeing him, always calculating. The fat man had taken great care to assess constantly what the hillside thought of the architect. Every adverse or envious word added grist to his mill, and he repeated them willingly to all who would listen. The architect never heard these scraps of calumny or gossip because he kept himself so aloof. But he never doubted what the silken elder was doing. He was plotting. And all the while, those magnificent rocks continued to arrive. On the green slopes of Newgrange, like some breed of strange animal. Some gleamed like flowers in the sun. Others seemed darker, but if you look closely, you could see that those stones had souls. The most beautiful specimens went straight to the carvers. In the beginning, the architect declared that certain stones would bear messages to their ancestors, words of gratitude, symbols of praise. This work would take as long, he said, as the building itself. He chose the most skilled men and women to make these designs. And remember, their only tools were stone. They tapped and leveled and etched and caressed. Each day brought a small advance or a giant leap, a tendril materializing, a whorl beginning to uncoil. The architect drew the design in the mud and they copied it. They alone never feared the architect, and in return he made them into an elite group of Newgrange society. Now, by the end of the 12th year, most of the construction work was done, as the architect had promised. But now he came to a standstill, facing a sharp and important challenge. He wanted different stones, beautiful stones, for the front of the building and the facade, but he didn't know where to find them. And already he had gathered every significant rock within a radius of 40 miles. Perhaps Olalla would know where to get more rocks. But as it happened, fortune rode in, as fortune will for those she favors. One day, a little round boat, like a bowl made of cowhide, bounced up the River Boyne. Inside it sat a small man with no hair, who looked up and admired the great work in progress, all those huge stones forming a wonderful giant ring embedded in the earth of the hill. To him, a stranger, well, this edifice seemed nothing short of astounding. Indeed, it seemed no less amazing to the people of Newgrange, who had watched it rise stone by stone, whether shown naked in the light after rain, or shrouded in the mists of the dawn, or casting long shadows down the hillsides evening. The building had the power to make you stop and look at it many, many times every day. And now the little bald man in his bowl of a boat saw it and couldn't take his eyes off of it. Then he told the people of Newgrange that where he came from, he had seen stones that looked as white as the moon. The angry woman rushed to tell this news to the architect. And the next day he and she both set out from Newgrange. In the boat with them sat the little bald man, and they towed his coracle behind them. When they reached the moment where the River Boyne joins the sea, they sailed 5 days south from there. And then they entered the mouth of another river and followed it inland. That journey came to more than 70 miles. Out of the boat they climbed, and the little bald man led them over 2 hills down into a large hollow. There was grass overgrowing everything here, but when they scrambled at it, they found underneath precisely what the architect wanted. Loose rocks of all sizes, stones so beautiful that he believed they had been hidden there for him to find. They did indeed look like the moon. They looked like silver dipped in cream, pearls that the gods had hidden in the grass to be stumbled upon like treasure. Surely the Fey folk left these. The architect knelt to look at them, stroked them, examined them. It was the only time the angry woman ever saw him close to tears. Now he believed that his great task was slowly coming to a wonderful end. No, but you do like cream. And they were the color of cream. Therefore, well, I'm not sure therefore what, but anyway. So for the next 3 years, when the leaves came back on the trees in the spring, 100 boats took to the waters of the River Boyne and disappeared round the bend in the river to fetch those wonderful cream-colored, moon-like stones from Wicklow. After the first few trips, the architect rarely went again, because he had yet to face the biggest challenge of all now. One sunlit morning, the people of Newgrange looked across the distant ridge and saw a man behaving strangely. Sometimes he stood and made a frame of his arms against the sun, or he turned to face the 4 corners of the world. Soon they realized that the distant figure was the architect. But what was he doing, they asked themselves, inspecting the whole world? As they watched, he descended the ridge and returned to the hillside, where he also stood and framed his arms to the sun. With an array of sticks, long and short, with stones placed at intervals along the ground. He took measurements. He paced out distances. He eyed levels. He directed some of the children to gather a collection of small but long stones. Each stood perhaps no more than a foot high, and he built a little corridor of these, covered it with a tunic, and knelt before it, holding a rushlight and then a torch under the tunic. They thought he was trying to measure the length of the sun's rays on the grass. That is indeed exactly what he was doing. And even more than that, he was measuring the effect of light upon everything, on his fingers, against the stones of various heights, among the shadows of the trees, upon the ridge of the hills. Sometimes he came down to the workplaces or the dwellings. He took hold of the first person he saw, and he made them stand still while he measured their shadow on the grass. To their intense curiosity, he would walk in a circle around them, or crawl on the ground with their feet, grunting and thinking. Now, naturally, nobody asked him what he was doing. By now, they had learned not to. But in front of their eyes, a great idea was being born. Every morning, afternoon, or evening, on every slope of the ridge, every level of the hillside, where he held his hands to shade against the sun, or measured the different lengths of a woman's shadow or that of her child, he advanced the cause of science, and therefore man's very understanding of the universe. At long last, came the day when everything seemed ready. All his measurements were taken, all his calculations were sealed, and now the building was finished. Now the carving had been completed, and now the last stones were set in place. What a long trial it had been! The mornings of extracting one or more effort from the builders, the afternoons of preventing one more whorl from cracking in the last throes of its carvings, the evenings of despair that not enough stones had yet been found and ferried, and the nights of fear that nothing would come of it all. In recent months, the architect had allowed himself to stand halfway up the hillside and look at his work, and he even began to permit himself to admire it. As he did so, others often drifted by, notably some of the elders who finally, but cautiously, asked if he would set a day for the opening ceremony. He replied with a blitheness that surprised them, "Of course." But he had known. He had known since the very beginning of the project what day he would choose for the opening ceremony. It had always been his intention to have the monument unveiled only on the December solstice, the shortest day of the year. No other day would do. Now, of course, he had never told anyone this, lest his experiments fail him. Had anyone known his intention, they would have called him foolish beyond belief, because the risk he had taken, the idea into which he had plunged all his efforts and 15 years of his people's hardest labor, was something that had, at best, in Ireland, a very difficult chance of succeeding. But he and he alone knew that, for the success of his project, he required this midwinter day, deep in December, to dawn with bright sunshine. Was he mad? Would the sun shine at dawn, without fail, in the middle of a winter, on a foggy island in the northwest of Europe? If anyone had guessed his plans, they'd have dismissed him as even crazier than he so often seemed. Of course, he was the only one who knew the magnitude of this gamble. The elders merely professed their pleasures at his choice of date. A great feast day, the moment of the year when their forefathers slept the deepest. But the architect, he felt nothing beyond a dull numbness. Oh, men had died. Babies had been born. New people had come to Newgrange. Others had left to venture into the interior of Ireland. And still, he went on building his monument. Now the end had almost arrived. Tomorrow his great inspiration would be to put to the test in front of everyone. He was not yet excited at the thought of all his planning and experimentation bearing fruit, nor did he dwell on what the silken elder would do to his body in the recompense if everything failed. Instead, memories came pouring back, especially when he thought of the most delicate and sensitive part of the building, a box of 4 flat stones placed above the door. Now this was the same rectangular box whose picture he once drew in the mud, more frame than box, 4 sides with no lid, no base. 2 of the stones were about 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and the smaller 2 were 3 feet by 1.5. Not until almost every other aspect and detail of the building had been completed would he add this crucial detail, the most important and single component. Twice he had to stop the builders filling the space for the box. Twice he had had to explain that, yes, he needed a rectangle above the doorway, that he had a personal detail to complete, without which the building wouldn't be finished. They looked at him, as they often did, somewhat vacantly, and they had to accept what he was saying. To make mortar, he chose, nabbed, and killed the calf himself, a russet and lively 2-month-old. He slit its velvet throat while its mother lowed in anguish 100 yards away. Then he pulled back the head and drained the blood, with the angry woman holding the stone basin. The next, 2 of the horses on the hillside yielded much of their tails to his knife, and he then mixed the mortar of blood and horsehair himself. And finally he erected the box with his own hands, as he would trust no one else with it. And so late in the afternoon, on the eve of the great day, reviewing all of these memories, the architect decided he would take one last look. The hillside seemed like an anthill. Tables out, pigs roasting, women and children building fires to stay light all the next day and night. At the entrance to the building, he climbed up to look at the 4 flat slabs in the mysterious rectangle. The guards at the door, one old, one young, looked away lest he see them staring at him. He climbed down, and stooping his great head and shoulders, he walked into the tomb. Now, you remember the momentous day he made his drawings in the mud of the riverbank? You recollect the diagram he etched in the mud? A round structure with a long line ending in a cross. This building of his was what archaeologists and historians now call a passage tomb, and now, finished, it completely represented the architect's drawings come to life. The line he etched was the passageway, and it led to the cross that he drew, a wide chamber at the very heart of the tomb. Along the passageway he went, between the slender rocks toward the chamber. Before the gloom became too dense, he let himself admire the handiwork. He loved the way his masons had merged the carved stones into the sidewalls, and he acknowledged how faithfully the mud patterns had been carved into those rocks, or in some cases embossed. Here and there he stopped to caress the shapes. He stroked stern triangles, merry whorls, geometric chevrons that looked like worried frowns, smiling triskalia and swirls, a little rippling field of diamond patterns, sweet presences on and in the stone. They reflected the world around Newgrange, the triangles made by the hilltops in certain phases of light, the rings on a tree's trunk, the eddies and the whirls of the River Boyne. The architect reached the inner chamber, where the building's heart opened out into a domed room. Earlier in the afternoon, he had placed a small bowl of fire, a rushlight, in the chamber entrance. He picked this up, he raised it to inspect the highest points of the chamber. More symbols carved into the stones, the juts on the walls, the dome shape deriving from a methodical corbelling, which imitates the way a crow's upper beak protrudes over and is supported by its lower beak. And as you know, another word for crow is corby in Scotland, or in France, corbeau. Walking around and round, looking at every stone, checking, touching, feeling all the surfaces, all the notchings, all the symbols, the architect came to a stop at the back of the chamber, directly in line with the passageway. Carefully, with great reverence, he dropped to his knees. Inside the chamber lay a huge, round, smooth dish made of sand-colored stone. To achieve its glossy finish took more days than anyone could count. Initially, the architect selected a flattish stone and told the carvers to hollow it out. And then he watched over them as they polished and polished and polished with their primitive tools. This was his massive vessel for the cult of his people's dead. He placed the light bowl on the floor and began to inspect the huge stone dish, and still, on his knees, he bent low, almost sniffing its smooth, curved rim. He leaned right in, deep over it, the better to see its heart. Then he lowered himself to the ground until he lay flat and prone, his chin almost at the dish's rim. He squinted across the rim into the passageway and narrowed his eyes for a long time, assessing, thinking. And when he rose, he dusted himself down and bowed respectfully to the dish. One last time he walked around it, stopping here and there, always looking from the passageway to the dish and back again. He shook his head many times as if marveling at what he had found there. What was this dish for? He and he alone knew. Tomorrow, everyone else would know. That is, if the skies stayed clear. And that, my friends, was a big if. He left the chamber. The wind had freshened, and he immediately looked up at the sky, hoping. So far, so good. His messenger hovered outside the entrance, waiting for him. He found this odd. The girl's value lay in the fact that she did her work soundlessly and almost invisibly. Yet every place he had gone that afternoon, she seemed to be there in front of him. Now he looked at the girl closely. There must be something wrong. She held up a hand and beckoned him. Suddenly he saw that she seemed very concerned, and he followed her as she led him out of the guard's earshot. Sir, you must hear what I have to say. Her voice was full of breath, but she spoke the words as directly as her mother would, and then she walked past him very quickly. At the top of the hill, where they spread the skins to dry. He nodded, and what she said next astonished him. Go up there, sir. I will meet you. Order the older of those 2 guards to join you. When you're among the trees, kill them immediately. Kill them. The girl looked terrified. She was now in her 20s and very beautiful. The architect had known her long enough to trust her completely. She ran off on a deceptive path across the hill in the opposite direction, giving the impression as she went that she pursued some errand on which he had sent her. Strolling to the doorway of the tomb, he commanded the younger guard to fetch 4 men whom he named. He waited at the door until they arrived, and he gave them their orders. Guard the entrance with their lives. Let no one in. And then stood down the junior guard and beckoned to the senior one, as the girl had directed. In single file, they walked quite quickly up the steepest part of the hill, past the longhouse. At the top, he veered right, hearing the guard breathing heavily behind him. Up on the slope, the men and women worked on the skins, scraping and cleaning. The stench, which everybody else found appalling, pleased the architect in some way he never quite understood. All the skinners rose and stood respectfully, their backs turned as he passed by. Ahead he could see the gap in the trees. The senior guard lurched awkwardly and dropped his stone axe. That was a serious offense for a guard, a slovenly matter, like a soldier dropping his gun, you understand. The man scrambled for the axe and began to yammer to himself. Fear had struck him. He and the architect cleared the far side of the bank and walked into the shade of the trees. Then the guard moaned a low moan. He was growing hysterical. Suddenly, in a little open space ahead, the messenger appeared, and the guard screamed. The blow that struck the man and the knob of his throat drove his head so far back that it seemed to hang down his spine. For the rest of her long life, the messenger remembered the sound of that blow, a kind of dull crack, like a stone hammering down on a smooth log. The architect had delivered the blow with the edge of his hand. He went forward to hear what she had to say. The elder, sir. You know which one. He's been talking to that guard. They have people waiting up here. People? Other than lone travelers, such as the little bald man in the coracle, few people visited Newgrange. Those who did come by never surprised the residents. The view from the hill revealed the river east and west for long stretches. The hillside's peak offered a view for miles. Sorry, I think I smell cookies also. Cookies. Well, sorry, got distracted. Beyond the river bend. I'll show you. Where the black rocks are, sir. Beyond the river bend. I'll show you. Now that was the one place whence someone could approach Newgrange unseen. As they trotted forward, she said, They're to come in early tomorrow, sir, before dawn. They have many, many weapons. How do you know this? I followed the elder. That's how I saw him. And I heard him talking to them, telling them. The guards saw me. Why didn't you tell me earlier? I've only known since noon, and I was so afraid of you, sir. I can't speak easily to you. He reached out and patted her hair. They stopped whispering and trotted on through the wood. As they climbed out of a gully, the girl dropped to her haunches and pointed. Ahead, 2 men stood under a tree guarding the path. The architect signaled to the girl to hide. From a small canyon, she watched him slink like an animal into the bracken. In a moment or two, she saw him again, on the top branches of the largest tree. She had known that men were required to endure severe trials before warriorhood. One of these required them to move through the woods without disturbing a leaf or breaking a twig. Many of the boys and girls discussed these tests endlessly and tried to imitate them, hoping they too would join the warriors' elite. Few of them made it. Now, she was watching this power at work. The architect flattened himself along the thickest branch of his tree and looked down. Below him, the 2 sentries stood close together, blocking the narrow path. The architect edged along his branch and eased himself onto a much thicker bough directly above the 2 guards. Nothing in their behavior suggested that the guards heard anything more than the breeze through the leaves. Many times in her life, the girl told the story of what happened next. In each hand, the architect held a stone larger than his own fist. And then, as lazily as a man waking from a warm sleep, he rolled his body around and dropped from the branch. Against the sky, the girl saw his body fall, his hair like a lion's mane, and she saw his hands connect with the guards' heads. They were dead before she heard their skulls crack. The architect picked up each body, pitched it into the undergrowth, as though tossing a log on a fire. That a man capable of such delicate calculations, sensitive enough to judge the force of the wind and the brightness of the sun, should also possess such massive strength, made the girl marvel evermore at the mention of his name. Now the girl didn't move forward to join him until he beckoned, and now they ran on, and she led. Presently she darted to the left and led him up a rocky, dark ways where there was no path. High on a hill where the brambles and briars clustered to the deep firs, she dropped to her hands and knees, as did he. She pointed, then watched him lean forward and look down. Below them on the flat stones by the river, a wide camp of armed men made preparations to destroy the architect and his work and his people and his very life. In their midst stood his old enemy, the fat and sleek, silken elder, talking to a big-eared stranger. The architect and his messenger eased back from their hiding place and ran home without stopping. He warned her to speak nothing of what she saw. His hands on her quaking shoulders, he said, "You've done better than any man could ever do." In Newgrange, all warriors lived and worked in the House of Axes. They spent many of their days making new weapons and sharpening old ones. The architect went there now. For the next 3 hours, he explained the enterprise and supervised the preparations for an attack. "Swiftness and silence, that's what I want, above all. Be vicious, be silent, be swift. I will lead you." They stripped down to the minimum of clothing. They greased their bodies with pig fat. They checked their weapons, stubby and pointed hazel sticks charred for hardness, the short stone axes preferred by some of the younger warriors, and leather slings full of fist-sized rocks that had been shaped into jagged spikes. Into the night, the architect led a force of 8 men and 6 women. They stole down to the river by a pathway where nobody on the hillside would see them. The 6 women fell in directly behind him, 2 by 2, each one fearsome in battle. Then came the 8 men, and every one ran as light as dancers over the ground and clambered into the boats. The architect could see dimly behind him the shape of each boat. His orders to them had been to keep as close to the near bank as possible. Although the leaves had all gone, overhanging branches gave them good shelter. He checked the skies again. From tomorrow, he would no longer have a crick in his neck from looking upward. Every day recently, and sometimes it seemed to him every minute every day for the last 15 years, he had stared at the sky. Tonight all was clear. No moon, the stars sprinkled everywhere. "Stay bright. Oh, stay bright," he whispered to the heavens. "This night of all nights, this coming dawn of all dawns. Oh, stay bright." The gentle slap of the oars in the water, the lapping of the river against the nearby bank, the world wished to calm him. Behind his boats paddled in the leaved waters of the river bank with the gentlest of sounds. The black stones of the promontory began to show. Further along, and in from the water, he saw the glow of a dying campfire. But no guards on the river? What kind of fighters or wild raiders were these? Were they arrogant? No, they were careless. Had they not yet missed the 2 Western sentries whose skulls he had loved cracking? He said to himself, I'm lucky tonight. My messenger brings me good luck. Maybe I'll be lucky tomorrow, too. His boat nudged ashore with a tiny crunch, and he eased himself out. Behind him, all the others disembarked, and as he did, crouched on the flat stones right by the water. Stay close, his gestures told them. Stay for the moment. He ran forward, crouching, searching for the heavy shape of the silken elder. Nothing but embers remained of the fire. Bodies lay slumped all over the camp. These were mostly young men, and young men make heavy sleepers. No matter where he searched, he found no trace of the silken elder's fat bulk. His comrades arrayed themselves into 2 lines either side of him. Crouching, he went forward again, the others tiptoeing with him. Within a moment or two, he came to the first sleeping body. Reaching down the eyes of the others watching him, he stifled the man's mouth and nose with a fierce hand and swiftly cut the throat with his sharpest bone knife. It took less than 2 seconds. The man sagged back with a gurgle. The architect held the head until it stopped writhing. The man never knew how he died. Nearby lay 2 other sleeping bodies. He directed a woman and a man to kill them in the same way. Again, not a sound. He and his warriors slipped like shadows, from body to body, cutting, killing, and in some cases strangling. And nobody made a noise. Well, until almost the last sleeper. He woke, sat up close to the dying fire, saw them and shouted. But the man died as he yelled. One of the warrior women rammed a stone in his mouth and down his throat. At last, a man also started to shout. An axe in Adam's apple killed him. Afterward, the raiders darted here and there like cats, checking each body was truly lifeless. Others tested the camp's boundaries in case sentries had been posted out there. The architect himself went to the fire and threw on a log, made it brighter. Where was the silken elder? He himself wanted to silence that smooth, insulting voice and bring him home to expose his treachery. No sign of the man, not on the ground, not among the many bodies. He picked up one enemy weapon, a knife, then another, a spear. And, remarkably, these had been made of something different. Not stone, but something just as hard. But these weapons felt lighter and very much sharper, and they gleamed in the glow of the fire. The architect instructed 2 of his fighters to collect all the raiders' weapons, which made a clanging noise, the way their own stone knives and wooden spears never did. Soon all the swords and knives and spears lay in a pile by the rekindled fire at the feet of the Newgrange warriors. Flames from the campfire lit their triumphant faces. Excited eyes and greased bodies glinted in the dark. One laughing woman wiped a splash of blood off her bare shoulder. They began to chatter, as all excited people do, but the architect held up a hand to silence them. He had heard something. Before anyone else could move, he grabbed a knife from the pile, turned, and ran to the water. Someone had stolen one of the boats. The architect swam to it, caught the stern. Turning, the escaper tried to lash out with the paddle, but the architect grabbed it and dragged the fugitive into the water. His fighters raced to the flat stones to help their leader. All looked shocked when they recognized his captive. The silken elder. Smooth as ever, the fat man began to babble. The architect grabbed the man's face, forced open his mouth, and rammed in a fold of wet hide. He then tied a strip of hide around the elder's mouth. They trussed the man with skins and dumped him into the boat. When they got back to Newgrange, it was past midnight. Music and laughter carried on in the wind. Torches and bonfires blazed. On the riverbank, the architect praised his warriors. At his direction, 4 men carried the silken elder by a dark route to the long house and hid him, bound and gagged under a pile of skins at the rear. Bowing one by one to their leader, the other fighters scattered. The architect turned away from them and walked toward the great white shape that dominated the hillside, his creation, his masterpiece. Not long now, he murmured. He looked at the sky, was clear as night could be. Not long. Not long. Back in his house, his messenger lay asleep, and he trod softly in order not to wake her. She had left some meat and milk on the floor by his bed. He ate and drank. The girl woke, rose, and came forward silently. She had never so deeply resembled her mother, but somehow without the angry face. He reached to her face and put both his hands to her cheeks. the most coveted gesture of approval. Then the architect placed his hands on her shoulders and embraced her. And from that moment she knew that if all wishes came true, she would spend the rest of her life by his side and bear his children. He lay down on his own bed, closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. The girl sat by, watching over him, knowing that this might be the very last night of his life. Exactly 1 hour later, lit by the single rushlight, the architect stood in the center of the log house and told the elders what had happened in the night. He described his messenger's discovery, the attack on the 2 sentries, the verification that an enemy party had gathered, the night raid, the trust betrayer, the remarkable new weapons. The elders, without saying so, knew what had to happen next. The fat man had to die. But in accordance with custom, he would be allowed last words to the people, because he was an elder. They decided to untie him, to take the leather gag from his mouth, and let him stand before the people. Then he would be denounced and killed. 4 guards fetched the disheveled man, who had not surrendered any of his suave manner. The chief elder addressed him and summarized the man's offenses. He told him that he'd be granted his right to speak. After that, the architect himself would deliver the recompense, which was also the punishment for treachery. In his smoothest voice, the silken elder began to protest. "Don't believe these lies about me," he said, but the chief elder turned away. The procession of the elders formed up and went outside. What a great sight they saw. All along the hillside, the people stood by their bonfires. They waved and they called to the elders to visit them. Everywhere, the children held out gifts of food and drink. The elders, including the fat man, walked among them, accepting something from everyone, stroking the children's heads, praising the gifts, all in flickering, firelit darkness. Skin drums beat rhythms. Reed pipes played. Boys and girls laughed, slowly, joyously, winding by every bonfire on the hill. This procession at last reached the entrance to the circular white building. The elders turned to face the chanting, swaying crowds. Behind them, the white high walls of the mysterious and great monument reflected the firelight. Easily the tallest among them, the architect stood at the edge of the group. His elder's pride in him showed. The eldresses touched his arms, his hands. Someone tapped his shoulder, and he glanced around. The angry woman. He looked at her as though expecting reproof. Once the building work had been finished, he had seen little of her, and he expected that she grieved. But instead, she clasped his hand, looked into his eye, and said, "Thank you for the trust you've placed in me and mine." And she slipped back into the crowd to enjoy the architect's triumph. Tawny and strong, like a lion in his pride, he looked all around Newgrange, at the happy people, the piles of food, the bowls of drink, the lights reflecting on the dark river flowing below. For this moment, he had devoted every ounce of his spirit he could find within him, day in, day out, every minute, every second, every hour, every breath of the last 15 years. The chief elder made a grand gesture with his arms, and the speakers came forward. At large gatherings long before megaphones or public address systems, speakers, men chosen for their loud voices, relayed the words of the speech throughout the crowd. When the orator spoke, the speaker nearest to him called it out to the crowd around him, where the next speaker picked it up and relayed it onwards, and so on, until everyone there had heard every word the orator had to say. And this is how they did it before they had inter-sim links. Perhaps we'll need to do that next time if we can't get the sim links working. In any event, off to the east, a long stripe of lemon light began to paint the sky. The architect knew they must hurry. On a wood pipe, the caller blew what sounded like an everlasting note, and he didn't stop until silence had fallen across Newgrange. At intervals down the hillside, each waiting speaker looked to the chief elder. From his place at the heart of his semicircle of elders, the old man began to speak. Beside him stood the silken elder, who, despite all, had the right to speak too, even interrupt. "My people! My people!" the speakers echoed. "In a moment you shall hear the voice of another elder. You shall know that he is speaking because it's the last right of anyone who betrays us to tell us his thoughts." The speakers looked so surprised that some of them almost failed to relay these words. A moan of wonder rose from the crowd. This elder was found to have befriended a party of invaders. They intended to capture all we own, to make every one of us their slaves. The moan from the crowd became a shout, which the speakers quelled with warning gestures. But, the chief elder turned his right hand and pointed to the architect, this man, who in the coming dawn will honor our dead with his great new monument, discovered their treachery. He and our warriors killed the raiders and brought back the betrayer to face death. Cheers rose. The warriors who had been on the raid raised their bare arms and shook their fists to the stars. Therefore, now the chief elder pointed to the betrayer, you know what will happen to him. He'll give recompense. At this, the crowd fell silent. Those among them who had seen such a fate talked of little else for months afterward. Some voices protested, no, no. The silken elder stepped forward 2 paces, setting himself up in a more prominent position than his chief, and spoke again. But I shall begin with the words chosen for this great day. I shall reveal to you blessings, which shall be ours and our children's and their children's. The speakers relayed these words. The silken elder stepped forward with another pace. Now he stood near the front edge of the crowd. He looked all around like a man seeking a way of escape. Yet he made no move. He waited until all the chief elder's words had been passed on, right down to the crowd at the lowest level, down to the bonded, the slaves, and the unsound whose place was by the water. And then he spoke. And today I shall reveal to you curses under which each of you and each of your children's children shall labor forever. Curses for all of you. The elders muttered. If they could have done so, some would have killed a man then and there. But the chief elder, who knew that a man's own bitterness condemns him, said, we shall always be blessed with a land full of milk and honey, the riches of the earth. The betrayer countered. But quarrels of the land will set father against son, brother against brother, husband against wife. The crowd began to shift, uncomfortable and confused. Our descendants, intoned the chief elder, shall be men of strength and wisdom, women of beauty and love. The fat man waited, then cried out, but we shall abuse and disrespect our children without reason. Never! Shouted the angry people on the slopes. By now the chief elder wished this to end. He spoke his next blessing. Though strangers may come among us and attempt to defile us, they shall not prevail. You shall be conquered again and again, roared the silken elder. Your seed, breed, and generations shall be made subject to others. The chief elder spoke again. Our fighting men will become feared wherever water flows or birds fly. Your fighting men will destroy the root of thought, the soul of reason. The betrayer's voice carried much farther than that of the frailer chief elder, and he spoke his words much more fiercely. But suddenly he stumbled. His hands trembled, his knees shook. The chief elder spoke again. Our ancestors shall bless us. They shall visit us here, on this hillside, again and again. The silken elder recoiled, stumbled once more. For years, he had tried to discover what lay at the core of the architect's plan. He had always feared the architect would outwit him by forging some new connection to the past and would indeed create, as he had promised, something wonderful. And now the rage the silken elder had contained for 15 years attacked him. His chest felt on fire. He could scarcely speak. He was so angry. Our ancestors, he cried, shouting so loudly that no speaker felt the need to carry his words forward. Our ancestors will be misrepresented. Men will use the power of the past to give themselves the power to the future. He screamed the final words and drew himself up and back like a man suffering a mortal blow. Those nearest to him saw that his face grew as pale as the stones from the quarries of Wicklow. The chief elder knew what was happening. A year ago, the silken elder had come to him and said he had been suffering pains in the chest. Cures were offered and taken, nothing further had been said, and now the chief elder smiled benignly at the betrayer. I have at last a most wonderful blessing. In time we shall spread our breed and our blood to other lands, to other people. Everywhere we go, we shall always be known to come of this land. We shall be known as people who bring light wherever they go. He stepped back. A cheer began, a cheer that would and should have been mighty. But the silken elder staggered forward and began to speak. His voice had grown so weak that two of the nearest speakers ran to his side to hear what he had to say. And these were his words. It shall indeed be the case that your children and their children and their children's children forever will go to other lands and be among other people. But your descendants will leave because this land will drive them out, to drive them away, will not be able to sustain them, will not be able to give them enough food and drink. He stopped, incapable. His words had been uttered with such passion and feeling that the speakers who relayed them gave them a respect close to fear. The last voice of the last speaker, echoing down by the reeds and the rushes, died away. In complete silence, every eye watched the torchlit events on the hill. The silken elder raised himself for one last time to his full height. He had something else to say. While his right hand clutched at his chest, he held out his left hand and used the index finger as a rigid pointing arrow, which traveled around the semicircle of the elders. He lurched forward, intending to stab his pointing finger into the architect's chest, but he made no more than a few steps before he collapsed on his face. His forehead struck the stone step at the entrance to the tomb so loudly the crack echoed in the dawn. And somewhere a night bird called, a warbling and melodic sound. Nobody ever knew what killed that silken elder. Was it the pain in his chest or the cracking of his head on the wide, thick, flat stone? His chief elder spoke again. All the watchers saw now was a fat man who had been one of their chosen number, now revealed as a traitor, lying dead at their feet in the entrance to the tomb. Blood began to seep from his nose onto the stone. In the silence, the chief elder gestured the guards to remove the fallen man's robe and take away the corpse, and in the silence the chief elder draped the robe on the shoulders of the architect. A baby cried somewhere. The architect turned to look at the ridge, and as brightening light seeped up from the east, he beckoned the elders into the mouth of the monument, into the very mouth and heart of the monument. In total darkness, they followed him tentatively. Heads bent slightly so as not to hit the stones of the roof. Ahead they could see the flickering lamp. When their eyes became accustomed to the gloom, they began to admire the rocks, the structure, the carved symbols. They reached the central chamber. The architect arranged the group in a semicircle behind the polished stone dish. And for a moment he held up the gas lamp, the small lamp, so that the elders could inspect the chamber. Each felt overcome with wonder at the magnificence, the elaborateness, the enormous magic of it all. But when the architect blew out the light, total darkness fell, black as a mine. And outside, the dawn began to spread across the sky as clear as joy. Nobody spoke. One or two coughed. The chief elder breathed heavily. Someone shifted from one foot to another. Soon the breathing of the group melded into one rhythm, as though they had all fallen asleep standing up in the darkness. The architect never took his eyes off the passageway. He waited and waited. Not for a moment did he fear the elders' impatience. The earlier events had dismayed them, but what they were about to see would renew them as never before. He stared toward the passageway, and his heart began to sing. "Look," he told the elders. "Look toward the door." That morning was the winter solstice, the 21st day of December. Outside the tomb, the upper rim of the sun's disk had begun to peep over the top of the ridge. Without mathematical instruments, calibrations, or any of our scientific tools, no compasses, set squares, sextants, or slide rules. The architect had calculated that each December solstice, the people of Newgrange would invite the rising sun to enter the tomb through the little rectangle of the 4 flat stones above the door. If the sun accepted the invitation, that is to say, if the clouds permitted, the sun's rays would travel along the passageway as the sun rose, and when fully risen would come to rest in the stone dish. Imagine his judgments from the Nassars, from the skies of winter and summer, from the speed of the sun's rising, taking into account the height of the hillside, the depth of the building, the color and thickness of the stone, the length of the passageway. He calculated miraculously. At the farthest end of the tomb, red gold colors tinged the edges of the rectangular aperture, making it look like a box full of light. Next, a shaft of sunshine slid through the box and lit the floor, just inside the entrance. The elders watched this glow and became transfixed. Not a word, not a sound did they make. Outside, the sun had started to climb over the ridge. Inside, the shaft of light, beaming through the narrow little box over the door, began to travel slowly toward them. Steadily, with no jumps, no lurches, the light filtered down the passageway. Its golden yellow beam, as thick as a man's arm, flowed slowly. Slowly. It was as though the sunlight was honey from a bowl that someone had tipped over and spilled into a long, pleasant stream. The architect could scarcely breathe. Ah, it had worked. After all, after everything, the rain, the blood, the death, the cracked bones, the stone, the fatigue, it had worked. He clasped his hands to his chest, a rare display of feeling. When the sunbeam reached the edge of the chamber, its yellow-orange light began to glow upward into the gathering, gilding the elders' faces. The ray seemed to hesitate for a moment. Then it surged forward until it splashed into the great stone bowl, began to fill the dish, and it filled it exactly. Not a drop of sunshine slipped over an edge, not here, there, or anywhere. The final resting place of the sun for that brief moment was precisely within the full circumference of the bowl. Leaving no area of the bowl's stone surface dark or cold, it lay there like a golden sphere. Outside, the rising sun had just cleared the ridge. "Here in this dish," pronounced the architect, "we will warm again the bones of our beloved dead." The elders, one and all, began to weep. In the fire of the visiting sun, their faces shone like the faces of children lit by a golden lamp. And then, as gently and as miraculously as it had come, the sun began to retreat, slipping back down the passageway, and finally sliding back out through the box of light to warm the rest of the world. Now, in Ireland, since that morning, on every clear-skied December solstice, except for those centuries when grass and foliage overgrew the tomb, that wondrous ray of light that responded to the architect's great invitation and then entered the building. And when it lies in the stone dish, it looks as though the sun, the greatest god of our skies, now rendered mellow and sweet, has come to earth for a golden moment, by wondrous invitation from the architect of Newgrange. And that's the end of our story tonight. Be sure to join us Thursday night, 7 p.m. Pacific Time, March 12th. That's Friday the 13th Eve. Ooh. For a brand new story from Storylink Radio called The Shaughneke's Shadow. On Friday the 13th, just 4 days before St. Patrick's Day, in the desolate bogs of modern Ireland, a person vanishes without a trace, leaving behind an empty room and a chilling silence. But where the police see a cold case, folklore student Sarah sees a pattern, one written in the ink of a century-old manuscript. The Shaughneke's Shadow. The silence is chilling, but the Shaughneke's story is louder. Don't get lost in the dark. Subscribe and click that bell now so you'll be notified. See you then.